I will start straight away. Before I start, a quick clarification that whenever I'm going to be using the word theatre, with it I understand a performance practice, not a literary practice. I think this is important to underline because following the development of performance theory in the 1970s by Richard Schechner, this clarification ought to be made, otherwise there is a confusion between theatre and dramatic scripts, which in my case theatre does not refer to the dramatic script, the literary script, so to be more precise. So I don't, well not a lot, but I still feel confident to say that I don't think it's going to be a problem to acknowledge Peter Gray's assumption in his introduction to Kaufmann's English translations of Nietzsche's works, that Nietzsche is, in all probability, the most studied German thinker. Even though, however, as Gilles Deleuze argues, not perhaps in the way in which he would have wished. Indeed, the legacy of Nietzsche and the way it has penetrated different fields of study, as we have seen during the past 2 days, is broad and far-reaching. His ability to turn accepted moral certitudes on the head, his skeptical questioning of confident realists who see the outside world as easily accessible to the investigator, are amongst the various reasons why Nietzsche remains irrelevant to those whose aim is to apply different perspectives to the nature of phenomena. Gay's assumption is therefore appropriate. Equally appropriate, however, is Deleuze's observation, particularly in view of the rather curious fact that music and the musical dimension that underpins Nietzsche's body of work remains relatively untouched and seldom discussed critically. Discussed critically, not discussed. They were discussed during this conference, but not critically. I feel that still the mention of music when we discuss Nietzsche at times tends to remain at most at the metaphorical level, but never really investigated with. Music seems to have been rather central to Nietzsche's life, central enough, in fact, to lead his friend and author Lou Salome, which you just mentioned, in her biography of the philosopher published in 1894 to actually claim that, I quote her, it was the impulse of music that he was not able to reject, and often he listened to tones at the time he wanted to listen to thoughts, unquote. It remains unclear, therefore, as Georges Rievère points out, why, and I quote him, in reading most commentators on Nietzsche, one would hardly suspect that he had been a composer or that he had ever even heard a piece of music, unquote. From a young age, Nietzsche developed a strong relationship with music that remained throughout his life and whose impact and relevance is evident in constant references to an art, without which, according to Nietzsche, life would have been a mistake. In this paper, I will reflect on Nietzsche's views on theatre and performance as expounded in The Birth of Tragedy by focusing primarily on the musical underpinning that inform his thoughts. To do this, I will venture beyond the philological relevance of the text to address instead what I consider as an early attempt to deal with the interdisciplinarity in theatre, a theme that later on, at the turn of the 21st century, will be established as a key aspect of theatre and performance scholarship and practice. In the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche develops what I will in fact call, and I'm proposing here, musical perspectivism that he adopts as a critical foundation for his analysis of ancient Greek tragedy. Through the course of my discussion, I will argue that this musical perspectivism is an important critical tool via which Nietzsche formulates his claims of interdisciplinarity as an actually ontological performance, phenomenon in performance. The birth of tragedy, how do I tell you?
Yes.
Not now, not this. Okay, so that is perfect. That should have been before. So, the birth of tragedy is a critique of the author's own contemporary cultural and critical context. Considering the importance of tragedy within the ancient Greek cultural and socio-political context, Nietzsche chooses it to be the analytical vehicle for his debate, ancient Greek tragedy. As such, the relevance of the birth of tragedy is twofold, in my opinion. Firstly, at a macro level, for the way it investigates culture as a foundational human phenomenon. Secondly, at a micro level now, a more specific level, for the way Nietzsche formulates an understanding of tragedy as a form of human expression in relation to its immediate context. Nietzsche does this by unearthing the complexities of the tragic when, rather than limiting himself to acknowledged philological strategies for his analysis, he reconsiders tragedy as a performance event. In fact, he addresses issues considered as important to performance criticism, including 1. The dynamics of the relationship between community and individual, and 2. The role of the human being as a living presence and source of action without which the tragic would not be possible. In other words, in the birth of tragedy, because of its unorthodox critical disposition, Nietzsche gives myth, and I think this is very important, a somatic upgrade, if you want. He starts considering myth, Nietzsche, from a kinesthetic point of view, something which was lacking at the time when he is developing his critique, that is, the late 19th century, essentially. For the purpose of my study, therefore, returning to the birth of tragedy is important for three reasons. Firstly, in it, Nietzsche locates music at the heart of his perspectives and hints at the music's ontological significance to his project. Secondly, because the Dionysian, a key underlying concept for Nietzsche, as has been discussed during this symposium, yes, is positioned as an agent of musical and performative phenomena. Thirdly, because of brief but very relevant references to dithyrambic practices via which the performative is foregrounded as a truly interdisciplinary phenomenon. In view of this, my investigation of musical perspectivism in Nietzsche will be framed around music and Nietzsche's conception of it, the Dionysian, which underpins Nietzsche's conception of music, and the dithyrambic as foundation for interdisciplinarity in tragedy. Nietzsche articulates his understanding of the idea of music in terms of differences between what he calls German music and Dionysian music. In turn, the Dionysian emerges as an underpinning element around which a conception of music beyond just formalistic premises, or what some may refer to as pure music, is formulated. The dithyramb serves as a foundation for Nietzsche's interdisciplinary framing of tragedy, which, together with the other two, allows him to locate tragedy beyond literature, because I think Nietzsche manages in the birth of tragedy to locate, position at least, tragedy beyond the realms of literature. At the heart of Nietzsche's expression in the birth of tragedy is the spirit of music, as the full title of the first edition of the text attests, which spirit is, in my opinion, a most important premise that the birth of tragedy makes very untimely at the end of the 19th century, when it was the least expected. Therefore, it is not music understood only as an aesthetic or oral phenomenon, but the spirit of it, indicating a broader conception of music, which I am relating here to musical perspectivism, aimed deliberately at restoring the human and somatic dimension to what is considered as an important genesis of theatre activity in the West. So perspectivism needs a bit of attention, as it is a critical strategy which Nietzsche adopts and develops through his body of work. Its outcomes, the outcomes of perspectivism, therefore, are the results of how, when, and why a thing is observed, critiqued, and studied. Perspectivism is contextual, not innocent, and never universal. It cannot be metaphysical and hardly teleological. A perspective is never the truth, but one of the various possible truths that constitute the thing observed. On the one hand, a perspective may appear vulnerable in that it can be seen as subjective and not broad enough. On the other hand, it may emerge as strong in its very subjectivity because of the plurality of outcomes that subjectivity implies. This objectivizes the thing observed and widens its potentials. A perspective depends on the position of the observer with respect to the thing observed. Usually the observer is in contention, therefore not in agreement with a priori universal assumptions, and is incredulous to acknowledged truth. As such, the observer is not bound to arrive at a determined point and is led to alternative understandings that would otherwise have been inaccessible. Although some argue that perspectivism is obvious and cannot be avoided, how can things be seen from no perspective? Others, like for instance Christopher Cox, believes that, and I'm going to quote, Nietzsche's perspectivism is less obvious and more problematic. Cox, in fact, warns that, I quote him again, the term is misleading since it suggests that a visual metaphor provides the key to Nietzsche's theory of knowledge. Cox's warning here is of relevance in that it problematizes perspectivism and locates it beyond simplistic associations to the notions of visual perspectives, which would, as Cox rightly points out, lead to perspectivism understood as a narrow analogy between seeing and knowing. Instead, he sees perspectivism as affective interpretation and argues that a perspective is constituted and directed by a matrix of active and interpretative forces which allow something to appear as a particular something. Here Cox injects into the notion of perspectivism the element of human involvement through emotion and direct experience. Perspectivism is therefore a critical strategy that feeds on direct human activity. In order to substantiate claims of human experience and interpretation with respect to perspectival knowledge, I will quote the only instance where, one of the few instances actually, where Nietzsche refers directly to the term in the gay science. How far I'm using obviously the English translations, how far the perspectival character of existence extends, or indeed whether it has any other character, whether an existence without interpretation, without sense, doesn't become nonsense. Whether, on the other hand, all existence isn't essentially an interpreting existence that cannot, as would be fair, be decided even by the most industrious and extremely contentious analysis of self and examination of the intellect. For in the course of this analysis, the human intellect cannot avoid seeing itself under its perspectival forms, and solely in these. Here Nietzsche associates perspectivism to 1. Existence and the interpretation of it, and 2. To the senses. As such, Nietzsche's perspectivism is grounded in a phenomenological and experiential dimension, which makes it even more relevant to my argument, namely that musical perspectivism adopted by Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy is a strategy which questions accepted and universal orthodoxies that locate tragedy and theatre in the trajectory of literature. Key to this shift in perspective is the Apollonian Dionysian trope that runs throughout The Birth of Tragedy. In the Apollonian Dionysian equation, the Dionysian represents human action in terms of kinesthetic processes of constant becoming. As Tracy Strong argues in what she considers as a turn around Platonism in Nietzsche, and I think this is important, that which is this idea of turning around the Platonic ideas, Nietzsche, how he does it, that which is the result of human action, and that therefore perspectivism is not of something. It is human action which leads to ideas of what is. Human action is therefore not referential to a thing, but actually is a constituent element of things in the process of their becoming. An understanding of a thing which is by necessity an a posteriori process is the outcome of perspective of human actions. This means that ideas are formulated if and only if human actions are first performed, and after perspectives of these actions had been developed. Now, the nature of phenomena is not something that can be anticipated because of the very fact that phenomena are in a constant flux of becoming what they are. This postponement is a condition of the Dionysian drive. Here we must also acknowledge the differences that constitute our action, which do not develop in terms of linear processes. We are a multitude of forces, drives, in action, and become what we are through processes, not one process, of different activities. This is Dionysian intoxication, which, in its orgiastic framing, appears as chaos. In this context, however, I would define chaos as the awareness of constant dynamic relationality. As Strong argues, I quote her, for Nietzsche, what something is what is made of it. That is, the relations that it enters into. In doing so, we also acknowledge that the nature of human action, which leads to what is ontologically interdisciplinary. It cannot not be interdisciplinary. In The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche investigates the nature of human action, a key element of the tragic, in terms of dynamic relations. To do this, Nietzsche adopts perspectives that are musically framed and which venture far beyond the philological and semiotic realm. The musical is therefore not in any way textual or referential, but rather an attitude of becoming loaded with kinesthetic and somatic undertones. Now, in view of this framing, it should now be clear why perspectivism is opposes metaphysical and teleological assumptions. Nietzsche's contention with Socratic interpretations of tragedy, and we don't have time to go into this now, but they are extremely important, As agents, he considered the Socratic interpretations of tragedy, Nietzsche and the birth of tragedy, as agents of closure based on rational processes that respond to metaphysical utopias. This foregrounds his musical perspectivism, framed around the tensions that emerge from the relations between the Apollonian and Dionysian drives. The Dionysian is the empirical drive that brings back to tragedy those elements which, according to Nietzsche, the Socratic perspective had ripped away. Via the Dionysian drive, Nietzsche hints at a poetics for theatre that acknowledged the relevance of physical presence in performance, thus shifting the weight beyond the written text to also include performed activity. In the opening chapter of The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche refers to the dithyramb as basis for his alternative, body-oriented poetics of tragedy, through which he develops an initial association with a musicalized physical disposition that preceded the tragic genre and was arguably a precondition for it. I quote Nietzsche here, in the Dionysian dithyramb, man is incited to the greatest exaltation of all his symbolic faculties. We need a new world of symbols, and the entire symbolism of the body is called into play, not the mere symbolism of the lips, face, and speech, but the whole pantomime of dancing, forcing every member into rhythmic movement. Then the other symbolic powers suddenly press forward, particularly those of music, in rhythmics, dynamics, and harmony. More clear than this, Nietzsche cannot be that there is something beyond language which the tragic addresses. Here Nietzsche's musical perspectivism points at a broad musical dimension which reflects in fact his contention to language-oriented poetics. Instead, the idea of a birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music is suggestive of a musical ontology that encompasses the performative and interdisciplinary poetics of the art of theatre. Nietzsche's vision of a theatre that untwists the logos in order to unleash, let go the bios, that is the scenic life, as developed by the performer's body and presence of theatrical performance, is based upon the the Dionysian dithyramb, of which music, dance, and song are constituent elements. Music informs symbolic imitation and allows the symbolic image to emerge. In fact, for Nietzsche, the essence of tragedy, I quote him, can be interpreted only as a manifestation and projection into images of Dionysian states, as the visible symbolizing of music, unquote. From this, Nietzsche infers that it is music that gives birth to myth. In other words, through Dionysian music, myth becomes flesh and is made visible through the performer via dance, movement, and song. This is what we call embodied awareness, through which the act of theatre or performance emerges and is transformed into experience. Body awareness is one of the essential aspects of theatre, in that energies, information, and experiences generated by and or taking place during the theatrical act are transferred kinesthetically through the bodies of the performers and the audience. Dionysian music is also a physiological experience for Nietzsche. That is, a music experienced through physical engagement, or what later on French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy would call the act of listening as a phenomenological occurrence. Nietzsche clarifies this by distinguishing between German music and Dionysian music. He explained that the music referred to in The Birth of Tragedy is not contemporary Germanic music, which is romanticism through and through, and the most un-Greek of all possible art forms, a first-rate poison for the nerves, doubly dangerous among a people who love drink and who honor lack of clarity as a virtue. This is Nietzsche, and I'm quoting him. No, because I think it's very important to establish the real difference between romantic music, what we mentioned, and what Nietzsche is referring to as music. Yeah. That is the music that allows the body to be really present and alive in what he is thinking of, the tragedy he wants to address. For Nietzsche, music, and here is the only association we can see between music, dance, and performance. For Nietzsche, music is in direct association with the Dionysian concept, which is in turn associated to elements including song and dance that are indicative of his physiological underpinning of the concept. Even more direct is Nietzsche's call to, and I quote him again, dispatch all metaphysical comforts to the devil, and speak the language of Zarathustra the dancer, the Dionysian monster. Raise up your hearts, my brothers, Nietzsche says, higher and higher, and don't forget your legs. Raise up your legs, too, good dancers. These claims, far from being metaphorical or poetic, because when we feel like we say that is poetic, that is metaphoric, that's what gives importance. No, wait a second. Because Nietzsche never said that this is metaphoric, let's not give it attention. Nietzsche said nothing. They are indeed indicative of an interdisciplinary ontology framed around Nietzsche's performative conception of theatre. The dithyrambic dramatist, who Nietzsche, in his fourth untimely meditation, describes as the actor, the poet, and the musician, is not an individual, but rather the chorus as a body of individuals that together compose the performance event. The performance of dithyramb is the activity of the ensemble of singer-dancers that constitute the dithyrambic chorus engaged in physical activity. The dithyrambic chorus, as a collective body, consists of the performers as creators of the text. The performers as the creators of the text, not an author, that central figure that Nietzsche, through the death of God, wants to eliminate. In fact, Nietzsche, it was mentioned, has a problem with the concept of logos. Since it was a proto-dramatic activity, it came before that this was involved in, this text should only have been, could only have been what in retrospect we refer to as a performance text. It is through the musicalized dimension of the dithyrambic event, consisting of song and dance, that Nietzsche arrives at a truly interdisciplinary foundation for performance. Now, in conclusion, I consider Nietzsche's critique of tragedy as an important foundation for performance scholarship. French philosopher Gilles Deleuze claims that, and I'm quoting, the birth of tragedy was not a reflection of ancient theatre so much as the practical foundation of the theatre of the future. Polish theatre maker Jerzy Grotowski, when discussing the ideas of French visionary Antonin Artaud, claims, and I quote him again, that only Nietzsche was ahead of Artaud in this domain. The chorus, one of the most Dionysian of Nietzsche's conceptions, manifests itself through interdisciplinary activity. This activity is framed around a musicality that Nietzsche, and indeed contemporary performance scholarship, believe ancient tragedy possessed. Tragedy, one of the beginnings of Western theatre, was the expression of a community of people through music, dance, and poetry. Choric activity, through its musicality and interdisciplinarity, manifested in rhythmic movement and song, made tragedy retain its liminal dimension between discursive and embodied practices. that gathering of individuals that survived the shift from ritual to dramatic activity is one effective proof of tragedy's interdisciplinary ontology developed via a musical perspectivism which foregrounds Nietzsche's conception of performance.